On this Saturday night, Russian rebellion reversal. Instead of a mutiny, the Wagner mercenary group backs off from Moscow.
There's an armed group which is not subordinate to Russia's armed forces, roaming around southern Russia, demanding recognition.
What it says about cracks within the Kremlin.
So this thing is a disaster for Putin, for the military, and it's a gift from heaven to the Ukrainians.
The Titan submersible mothership returns to port. What data investigators are gathering on board.
Two great nations and two great powers. Cheers.
And why the U.S. president is trying to woo India's right-wing leader.
Global National with Farah Nasser.
Good evening to you, and thanks for joining us. It has been an extraordinary day in Russia, with the biggest threat to President Vladimir Putin's leadership in more than 2 decades. Just 24 hours ago, an armed rebellion by the very fighters Russia had hired to help take Ukraine. Then this afternoon, as the private army got to the outskirts of Moscow, the founder of the Wagner Group told his forces to turn around. But the damage to Putin's image had already been done.
Под контролем. Военные объекты Ростова, в том числе аэродром.
Yevgeny Prigozhin says his Wagner Group forces took control of military facilities in Rostov-on-Don earlier today. But after reversing course, forces from the mercenary group have been seen preparing to depart the city of more than 1 million people. Residents are seen watching and even cheering as troops load up in tanks and military vehicles. Fighters from the militia crossed from Ukraine into Rostov-on-Don late last night. This afternoon, there were reports of fighting within Russia's borders as a convoy of rebel mercenaries quickly moved north towards Moscow. Now, even though it's been a chaotic 24 hours, the about-face is not uncommon for Prigozhin. Once a close ally of Vladimir Putin, he's quickly fallen out of favor, taking aim at Russia's military leaders. Redmond Shannon has our top story on how quickly this crisis was inexplicably solved.
Panic and commotion on the streets. But this is not Ukraine. It's Rostov-on-Don, one of southern Russia's largest cities, used as a hub for coordinating the invasion of Ukraine. Russia's Wagner mercenary group took control of its streets overnight. Other Wagner troops, meanwhile, barreled north toward Moscow.
Mama.
Along that route, this explosion in the city of Voronezh as Russian forces attempted to stop the advance. Wagner's leader Yevgeny Prigozhin said it is not a coup to replace President Vladimir Putin, but the country's military commanders. And he tried to assure Russians these events will not affect the war effort.
The main operational headquarters are functioning in the usual way. There are no issues.
Prigozhin has been at loggerheads with Russia's Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu for months, demanding more support for his men on the battlefield. This rebellion launched after he alleged Russian armed forces killed some of his troops in an airstrike. As Wagner convoys approached, tight security around the Kremlin in Moscow, the mayor cancelling public events and asking people not to go outside. Putin vowed punishment for what he called an armed mutiny, comparing it to the revolution that toppled Russia's monarchy a century ago.
It is a stab in the back of our country and our people.
Putin's other main enemy, Vladimir Zelensky, said Saturday's dramatic events show the Russian leader is presiding over chaos. But then, as the Wagner troops got closer to Moscow, news of a deal. Prigozhin said he was turning his men around, the literal U-turn apparently brokered by Putin ally and Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko. It appears as though Belarus will be Prigozhin's new home. The Kremlin says he will move there as part of the deal, and criminal charges against him will reportedly be dropped. In addition, Moscow says Wagner fighters who took part in the rebellion will also not face prosecution and can now join the Russian armed forces if they wish. Farah?
Redmond Shannon reporting from London. Thank you, Redmond. Prigozhin has said he turned his troops around to avoid bloodshed, even though the shadowy founder of the Wagner Group has been described as the cruelest commander in Russia's invasion. Putin and Yevgeny Prigozhin share relatively humble beginnings in St. Petersburg. Prigozhin, a petty criminal, spent much of his 20s in jail. When out, he opened a catering company, eventually getting Kremlin contracts, earning him the nickname Putin's chef. In 2014, Prigozhin started Wagner Group, a private military force that has been accused of atrocities, including mass murder and rape across Africa, and more recently alongside Russian forces in Ukraine. Prigozhin has recruited up to 50,000 fighters, many of them Russian prisoners. Last month, his forces seized the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. Prigozhin faces sanctions and criminal charges from various countries all around the world. For now, the armed mutiny appears to be over, but the chaos could have lasting consequences, both within Russia and across the border in Ukraine, where even the events of the past 24 hours haven't put a pause on the ongoing war. Touria Izri reports.
Russia's relentless shelling of Ukraine did not let up, even as the regime faced an unprecedented threat from inside its own borders. At least 3 Ukrainians were killed in Russian airstrikes on Kyiv. The shelling came as Wagner forces marched towards Moscow.
This thing is a disaster for Putin, for the military, and it's a gift from heaven to the Ukrainians.
A former Canadian ambassador to Russia believes the armed rebellion is another sign the Kremlin is losing the war. On the same day as the advance, the Ukrainian military announced it's regaining territory near Bakhmut. The Wagner Group captured the town last month.
This is going to deplete Russian motivation, which is pretty lousy to start with.
The Ukrainian-Canadian Congress believes the upheaval may present an opportunity on the battlefield.
Our best hope, our best scenario is that it will allow the Ukrainian army to advance back to reclaim territory and positions, that it will demoralize the Russian forces and lose their supply lines in terms of equipment and ability to keep shelling and firing.
NATO leaders remain cautious. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken called his G7 counterparts, including Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly, while Prime Minister Justin Trudeau held an emergency meeting with some of his cabinet ministers. "I have been briefed on the events unfolding in Russia," Trudeau tweeted. "We're in contact with our allies, and we will continue to monitor the situation closely."
The Western world needs to intensify the amount of weapons, the ammunition that it's sending to Ukraine so that it can fully take advantage of this situation.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is headed to Iceland for a summit of Nordic nations. The leaders are expected to discuss Russian aggression in Ukraine and now the Russian turmoil from within. Farah?
Touria Izri in Ottawa. Thank you, Touria. The Canadian ship that launched the ill-fated submersible trip to the wreck of the Titanic last weekend is now back in Canadian waters. 5 people were killed when the Titan sub imploded while descending to the ocean floor. Today, the ship was met by investigators in St. John's, eager to speak to people who were involved. Our Mike Armstrong is also there. Mike.
Well, Farah, the Polar Prince pulled into the harbor here in St. John's at about 8 a.m. this morning. Now, it did not dock where it was supposed to dock. The official logged destination was Pier 12 downtown. It instead pulled in across the harbor behind the Canadian Coast Guard building. Waiting already, Transportation Safety Board investigators.
So good afternoon.
TSB Chair Kathy Fox says none of the passengers or crew were detained, but there were interviews and there will likely be follow-ups. The ship had 41 people on board, including several family members of the men who were lost. Now, Fox says the TSB's mandate is to look at what went wrong and why. The U.S. National Transportation Safety Board is also investigating the fate of the Titan. Fox says they will be parallel investigations. They'll cooperate but be independent.
We are conducting a safety investigation in Canada, given that this was a Canadian-flagged vessel that departed a Canadian port and was involved in this occurrence, albeit in international waters.
Good afternoon.
Now, there will also be another investigation. The RCMP says the deaths at sea fall under its mandate. It's conducting a preliminary investigation to determine if a crime may have been committed. That would then trigger a full criminal investigation.
Our mandate is to look at the deaths and determine if anything contributed to their deaths that may lead us down a criminal path.
One of the things each investigation will look at is the voyage data recorder. A ship like the Polar Prince is required to have one. It records voices on the bridge. So investigators will have a good idea what was going on in the hours before the Titan lost communications and in those first hours after. Farah?
Mike Armstrong, thank you. The risk behind the rewards. Coming up, why advances in technology are exposing new vulnerabilities within Canada. Whether it's the internet or AI technology, it has definitely made everyday life a lot easier for Canadians in the 21st century. Not just for everyday tasks, but also for this country's infrastructure, healthcare, even the economy. Yet all of that is now more fragile in a world full of cybersecurity threats. For the West Block, Mercedes Stevenson looks into that and the risks that Canadians are now facing. Mercedes.
Farah, our way of life relies almost constantly on what experts call critical infrastructure. Things like computers and satellites to pay at the pump for your gas, your cell phone to call a friend or family member, or 911 in an emergency, and your bank card to pay bills or take out money. But that way of life is vulnerable to sophisticated cyber attacks. A Canadian intelligence agency is warning that our critical infrastructure is at risk from countries like Russia and China, or hackers who can hold information hostage, steal trade secrets, or paralyze physical infrastructure. And Canadian oil and gas companies are high up on the target list, according to that intelligence agency. This week on the West Block, Sami Khoury, the director for the Canadian Cybersecurity Centre at Canada's Signals Intelligence Agency known as CSE, granted the West Block an exclusive interview and revealed the magnitude of the threats. How often would you say attacks happen on Canada, both on government infrastructure and on private infrastructure? Is it a daily event, a weekly event, a couple of times a month?
An hourly event.
Wow.
Against the government, we have sensors deployed across government, and on an average day, we block between 5 and 6 billion signals coming against the government. These are automated systems that are looking for vulnerabilities. Having said that, we hear about incidents in the private sector constantly.
We also asked Mr. Khoury for some practical advice for our viewers in the wake of concerns about TikTok and other apps that could potentially be used to spy on Canadians or violate your privacy. Here's his advice on what you should know.
TikTok, like many of the other social media apps, request from the user an expanded access to a lot of personal information. Many of the apps ask for access to the contact list, to the calendar, to your coordinates, your geo coordinates, where you are. You ask yourself the question, why do they need that information?
So the message, the threat is real. Check your privacy settings and decide what information apps should have access to. We'll have more ahead for you tomorrow on the West Block. Farah?
Mercedes Stevenson in Ottawa, thank you. And as Mercedes mentioned, you can learn more about the cybersecurity threats Canada faces tomorrow on the West Block, which airs right here on Global. Rolling out the welcome mat for Modi. Ahead, the strategy behind India's state visit to the U.S. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi arrived in Egypt today. The two countries will hold bilateral talks aimed at strengthening ties. It's the first state visit to Egypt by an Indian Prime Minister in 26 years. And Modi is coming from a 4-day trip to the U.S., where he held talks with President Joe Biden. While the U.S. has accused India of engaging in significant human rights violations, analysts say the courtship is a strategic move. Eric Sorensen reports.
This isn't just pomp and ceremony for another guest at the White House. It's geopolitics of the highest order.
Two great nations and two great powers. Cheers.
India has been called the most important swing nation in the world, and U.S. President Joe Biden is trying to swing its leader, Narendra Modi, toward the U.S.
The challenges and opportunities facing the world in this century require that India and the United States work and lead together.
Modi's not an obvious dinner companion for the U.S. president. Biden has long championed human rights, while critics say Modi has cracked down on political opponents and stoked anti-Muslim sentiments in his country. Modi defended his record.
Democracy is in our DNA.
Overshadowing all of that is the strategic relationship. India, now the fifth largest economy in the world and a growing political force. The global power struggle that now exists is not new, with the U.S. and its allies in the G7 and NATO on one side, and the power axis of Russia and China on the other. Between them, India, balancing its considerable and increasing influence on the world stage. For decades, Indian leaders from Nehru to Gandhi rallied so-called non-aligned nations to leverage their power. Today, India is an economic giant on its own, exploiting its strategic interests among the competing powers. India has increased its oil imports from Russia tenfold in the last 2 years, helping Vladimir Putin finance his war in Ukraine. And India's bilateral trade with China is among the largest in the world. But India has also clashed with China over disputed border regions. So Washington's charm offensive includes more trade and military cooperation with India.
The United States has become one of our most important defense partners.
Both of us have a shared concern about some of the dangerous elements of the rise of China. The fact that China presents a threat that we need to collaborate on, I think that brings the two leaders together.
Prime Minister Modi's diplomacy has been called opportunistic, but it's working.
One of the defining relationships of the 21st century.
India is an ascendant power that the United States, like so many others, wants to harness. Eric Sorensen, Global News.
Thank you. A turning point for Ukraine. Next, we're going to hear from an expert on the attempted Russian mutiny and how it's impacted Putin's image in Russia. Now back to our top story. In the aftermath of what at one point seemed to be an attempted coup by Russian paramilitary group, the Wagner Group, against Moscow's leadership. The situation now seems to have de-escalated, but this unprecedented incident has exposed cracks within Russia and could have long-term consequences. Joining us now is George Beebe. He's the Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute. George, quite a day with Yevgeny Prigozhin marching his Wagner forces towards Moscow, then deciding to turn back. What's your take on the past 24 hours?
Well, I think it's been quite a wild ride. I think less than 24 hours ago, people were worrying about whether Putin might be overthrown by a military coup. They're also worrying about whether the Russian military would be so diverted by this unprecedented threat by this private mercenary army that they would have to divert forces from Ukraine and potentially deal a fatal blow to the Russian effort there. Now we have a deal, apparently brokered by Belarusian president, and it looks like Prigozhin, the head of this private mercenary army, is going to wind up in exile in Belarus. The Wagner fighters that were not in open rebellion against the Kremlin are going to sign contracts with the regular Russian military, and charges against everybody appear to be being dropped. Now, what I think this means is that the immediate crisis is probably over. Putin is not in immediate danger of being overthrown by this mercenary army. The threat to Russia's war effort in Ukraine has probably been averted for now. But I think this crisis, more broadly speaking, is not over yet. The damage that this has done to Putin's image inside Russia is probably significant, and the repercussions of this incident are likely to play out for some time to come.
What does it say about security, the state of security in Russia and defenses? I mean, that Prigozhin, first of all, felt emboldened to pull off this, but also to get as close as Hitler did it in 1941, pretty close to the Kremlin.
Well, I think some of his forces, I think, had proceeded that far, but recognized that while this march was going on, negotiations were also happening in Belarus with Prigozhin. So my guess is that the Russian military didn't do some things vis-a-vis these advancing mercenaries that they might otherwise have done had they not wanted to undermine these negotiations. They were driving up a highway. And the Russian military has a very substantial air force. It's relatively easy to target convoys that are driving up a highway using air forces. So I'm not sure that this was as close a call militarily as some are portraying it. Nonetheless, I think there are a lot of people in Moscow that are asking themselves, how did Putin allow this situation to spin so far out of control? And that's got to be injecting some real doubts within the Moscow political elite about whether Putin can continue to keep order in Russia in the longer term.
And then what happens also in Ukraine? I mean, you mentioned this contract that the Kremlin's going to get Wagner fighters to sign, right? But can the Russian government really sever ties between these mercenaries and Prigozhin?
Well, the thing about mercenaries is they fight for whoever's paying them. And my guess is that this was not quite so much a matter of political rebellion on the part of a lot of these fighters, so much as it was wanting to ensure that they're going to continue to be paid and supplied adequately so that they can, in fact, fight effectively. And that, I think, is something that the Kremlin and the Russian military leadership can ensure. And after all, I think one of the things that was going on here was that the Kremlin was very cynically exploiting these mercenary fighters, essentially outsourcing a lot of the burden of this war onto them so that it did not have to impose on the Russian military and impose much conscription on the broader Russian population. I think that was a real gamble on Putin's part. To try to avoid making some hard choices, and I think that gamble has shown to have backfired on him.
Interesting perspective. Thanks so much for your insight. That's George Beebe, Director of Grant Strategy at the Quincy Institute. Thanks for your time, George.
Thank you.
And that's Global National for this Saturday night. I'm Farah Nasser. Thanks for joining us. Tonight's Your Canada is Cranbrook, BC. Jeff Semple will be with you tomorrow. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Good night.